we've heard, but you did get started in Washington. Of course, you went to Western High School, didn't you? Yeah. And I rather enjoyed a few words in your book that told about your love for hanging out on Friday nights in your teens at the office of your Kiplinger Washington letter. And you learned that the discipline of thinking about big events in terms of what they would mean to people at the day-to-day level of life. It was a habit, you said, you would never lose. I wonder if in today's media world it's a little bit different from the one we started out in. Have they lost that habit that you referred to?
Well, let's see, is this working?
Yes, sir.
I think there are all kinds of writing, and kind that I've been trained to do and have made my profession is really very utilitarian writing. But utilitarian doesn't mean that it has to be dull. Harking back to my earlier times with my father, he was regarded by his staff as being a very facile writer, and that's only because they saw the final draft. And those of you who have practiced the trade or the skill of writing know that it ain't easy. That is, good writing, I think, isn't easy, and there's a lot of reworking and trial and error and one thing or another. Our kind of writing in my own profession has always been aimed at a specific audience. I don't mean a narrow audience, but it's been aimed at the audience's questions rather than starting from the inside out. We've always started from the outside in, trying to think about our readership, our audience, as best we know what it is, and then try to figure out what they need to know in order to do what they want to do. We don't tell them what they should do. We don't tell them what they ought to think. We just tell them what we think is most likely to happen, and then let them make the application in any practical way they can. That's a long-winded answer, and I'm not sure I got to the question. I'm not sure what the question was. Politicians have a great technique in Washington, starting off by saying, "That's a very good question." And then they answer the question that they want to answer.
Okay, you know, you used to tell me you'd tag along with your dad when in the early years. He went to call on the president and cabinet officials?
No, we never called on the cabinet. Well, I think we did occasionally. But I want to say another thing about our way of working. We don't do private interviews with any public official for publication. Because generally when a political figure wants you to interview him, he wants to put his ideas across, and he wants you to help him explain his point of view. And that's not our work. And we go to see public officials all the time, but what we ask them is, what do you really think? I'm not going to quote a source. I've never quoted a source in our whole career. We will incorporate it into our own thinking. We will massage it, and digest it, and ingest it, and then try to tell our readers what we think is, in our best judgment, what's likely to happen. And that's a far, far different world from having a front page interview with your own byline, which gives you a lot of attention and a lot of credit, but we don't do it.
But this is an innovative field your dad started. It was the beginning of the newsletter business. I don't think anybody else did.
There had been one Washington letter called the Whaley Eaton letter. Is Sid Levy here? Mm-hmm. Sid worked on the Whaley Eaton letter, and I think he's the only living human being who did. I think that's true, isn't it, Sid?
I think I'm still living, yes.
the Whately letter had a political attitude. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And Percy Whaley and Mr. Eaton wanted to persuade their readers to think the way they thought. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
Okay. That's a different job. And so when our letter came along with its typewriter type, underscore, dear sir, yours very truly, it was truly personal. And I think it did start a new style. I really do.
No question about it. I know John Eaton, son of Eaton.
That's
He's
right.
a pianist, well-known celebrity.
good one.
He didn't go into the news business.
No.
Your dad didn't try to make it go into the news business, did he?
He didn't have to. I grew up, as I have said many times, in my office, and that's almost literally true. And I reveled in it. And I think I did, I think I harbored the idea of being something else at one time, as boys do. And I actually harbored the idea of being a concert pianist.
No.
Until I got to the final recital and I decided, no, I'm gonna make it.
That wasn't music to your ears.
Sorry.
Kip is used to my.
I
I just, yeah, but you went out in the outside world of the newsletter in Washington. That was that by mutual agreement with your dad?
Yes, I worked in the office as an office boy and as a junior reporter, and I worked with my father as an author's assistant. But we both knew that you don't create a strong plant by starting it in a hothouse and then leaving it there. You've got to get out and live in the outer world and do it yourself, and then come back and use your talents.
You got experience outside of Washington.
San Francisco.
Yeah, that was the first.
Chicago.
Yeah.
And in and out, and Chicago, Ithaca, New York, the Gannett papers. Excuse me.
San Francisco was the Chronicle.
Yes.
For how long?
Well, that was interrupted by the call to come back and then for the war. As a matter of fact, I'm still on leave of absence from the Chronicle.
That's why it's
As a matter of fact, it reminds me, I called the publisher later on, Charlie, what was his name? And I said, by the way, I'm on leave of absence from the Chronicle, and you owe me my job. This was when I was editing the letter. And he said, okay, you can have it at the same pay you were getting when you left.
But the big, your big time was how many years? 8 in Chicago?
Yes.
First.
Those were good years.
Right.
Awfully good.
But the biggest years were the TV and radio and TV.
Yes, I started, again, I went out looking for a job in Chicago, and I had in mind going to the Chicago Daily News. And you remember, that was a distinguished paper. And I went to the business editor, and they didn't have an opening. And I stopped off to see my father-in-law's friend, Merrill Meggs, who was a vice president of Hearst. And I said, Mr. Meggs, if you were a young man like me and you were looking for a job as a business writer, where would you go? He said, I wouldn't. There's no money in it. And I agreed that he was right. But I did get a job with the Chicago Journal of Commerce, and that was a total surprise, because I went in looking for a writing, reporting job. And he said, well, how'd you like to write a column? Just out of the blue. And I had no idea what you did to write a column every day. And but I said I would.
You did?
Yeah.
But then you went into television.
Well, then that happened rather strangely, to tell the truth. put your mind back to if some of you are old, 1950. Television, there was no network yet. You had big stations in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles. That was about it, maybe a few others. And I got a call when I was on vacation. I was in Maine.
I've heard of it.
I was on Casco Bay.
Oh, yes.
Did you like that? And my friend in Chicago said, and I think I've told this story before, have you thought about television? And I said, yeah, we're going to get a set. No, he said, I mean, going on and doing the news. And I said, I couldn't do that. I'm not doing anything like that. Well, he said, I've got a client whose name is Lester Armour. And I'd eaten his ham, so I knew who he was. But he was chairman of a bank in Chicago, the Chicago National Bank. And they wanted a program done, a general news program, but done by somebody who knew enough about business that he wouldn't bollock it up. And he thought maybe I could do it. And we worked it out, and I did. And that was the start. Nobody knew anything about how you did it. I went down to NBC, I think, to try out, or WGN, I guess it was. And they sat me down at a desk, and I had some script that I had prepared, and they pointed my finger and said, go. That's the way it began.
And you were live, always? Everything was
Everything was live, and you could fall on your face. And that was a wonderful thing in those days of television, because you never knew what was going to happen. And I can tell you stories, I don't think I want to. But subsequently, when I was doing a program that I worked up with the Chicago Daily News called Impact, it was sort of a forerunner of the hourly shows, the NBC, CBS shows. You ranged over anything you wanted to do: spot news, background news, social conditions, art, music, anything. And we did shows from an ore boat anchored down in South Chicago. We did shows from the execution chamber of the Cook County Jail. We did one from an insane asylum. I did one on Skid Row. I remember that in those days we called those fellows bums or winos. I think we're a little more sensitive now. We don't call it bums and winos. They're homeless. But anyway, all sorts of things happened on those programs, and it was live, and you didn't know what was going to happen. I remember one time at the firehouse in Chicago, I was up on the second deck, and I was supposed to hit that slide, those poles, and they really have them, or at least they did, and slide down on camera. This is on the show. Well, we pulled the switch to start the program, and we took so much power that it blew all the lights in the entire place, and I slid down the pole in the dark.
You left your listeners in the dark.
Yeah.
The thing I enjoyed most in this little book you've just done, Letter from Washington, is about covering the conventions in Chicago. In '52, I was at that wonderful Eisenhower Taft convention.
Oh boy!
And that's when we're into something else now with these debates. But in those days, it was decided at
that really was where you picked a candidate.
Yeah, and was that the one where you were sitting behind a wall and heard something that gave you a scoop?
Yes. In those years, the Credentials Committee was tremendously important. I don't know whether it still is or not, probably.
I remember it was.
But if you remember back in the 50s, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party I guess they were not as far separated as they are today. And when Eisenhower came on the scene, or came as a rising potential candidate, he wouldn't say whether he was going to run, or he wouldn't say whether he was a Republican or a Democrat. He'd never voted. He'd been in the Army. And we didn't know for sure whether he was going as a Republican or a Democrat. And let me see, it was Senator from Massachusetts, Lodge.
Henry Cabot Lodge.
Henry Cabot Lodge came out of Chicago, and he was pumping Eisenhower to be the candidate on the Republican ticket. And nobody at that time knew whether he was a Republican. So I got an interview with him. I caught him on the fly, and I said, "What makes you think Eisenhower is a Republican?" And he just looked me in the eye, and he said, "He's a Republican." About that way. And the way he said it convinced me that he knew what he was talking about.